So we have a terrific panel for you today. I know we are what is separating you from lunch, and that's usually tough. Particularly, this is already lunchtime in Houston. In Mexico City, this is breakfast time, so you shouldn't have a problem if you come from Mexico. So we have a terrific panel on the upstream and on the bid rounds. And we have, my name is Francisco Monaldi. I'm the fellow in Latin American Energy Policy here at the Baker Institute. And we have as speakers Pablo Medina from Wood Mackenzie Latin American Upstream Research Team, Luis Moreno from Haynes & Boone, a partner in the Mexico office, and Benigna Leis from the country manager of Chevron in Mexico. So that will give us different angles and views on how things are going and what can we expect from the December auction and for the second round. Before starting the panel, as both Tony and the Secretary of Energy mentioned, we wanted to take a brief moment to talk about Edgar Rangel. Edgar Rangel, for those of you who didn't know him, was one of the commissioners of the CNH in Mexico, a brilliant academic that was one of the architects of the reform. And he passed away too early. Today would have been his birthday, so that's symbolic. And I thank Pablo for letting me know that. And we think he will be 43 today. So he was a very young star on the technocracy of the Mexican government. And for us, it's particularly tough because he had just told the Secretary of Energy a few weeks before that he was coming here. He was retiring and was going to come to work at the Baker Institute as a fellow. And we had tremendous plans, as you would imagine, for him and to do research with him. I met Edgar when we were both doing our doctorates at Stanford, and he was one of the most outstanding scholars that I ever met, and a very humble, one of those people that you don't hear anyone say anything but great things. And so we wanted to commemorate his work. We are planning, with the help of George Baker and Pablo, to create a place where we will have his work in just one place, web page and in the Rice Library, because we think it's a really important work that should be preserved. And so I wanted Pablo to just give a few comments on Edgar before starting the panel.
Sure. I mean, just very briefly, I think that the importance of Edgar was when the whole process started in the first attempt of the reform. That's when this team of Lourdes, Edgar, and other members of, let's say, the Mexican government started coming together and try to bring all the experience they brought from abroad, studying basically their graduate degrees, and try to put that into reality in Mexico. So Edgar, beyond being, like I say, very close work-related, he was a very good person. He was always trying to help Mexico, and you can tell that, basically he worked up until the point in which he wanted to stop, not because he wanted, but because he had to, and then things happen as it happened, but it would be his birthday, so I think he'll be happy to know that everyone is here, basically reunited, trying to make Mexico a better place, more so from the energy sector, which is what he wanted to do.
Thank you, Pablo. So the plan for the panel will be to have our three speakers make a first short presentation of about 5 minutes, and then we will have some moderated discussion by me, and then we will open the floor. So first, we will go in the order that you see them sitting here, because we thought it will be interesting for Pablo to give an overview, for Luis to go more into the legal perspective, and then for Benigna to give us a view from the industry side. So please, Pablo, go ahead.
Thank you. So once again, thanks for Tony, Francisco, for the invitation. I mean, we're very grateful having this opportunity of sort of share our views on what has happened up to this point in the upstream sector in Mexico, and also, more importantly, I'd say what we expect to happen in the next 12 months. I would like to start by, and I'll keep my comments very brief, mentioning that the government has done a great job at learning from mistakes. If you remember the shallow water exploration phase, you only had 2 blocks awarded out of the 14 that were available. Well, what happened afterwards was that the government realized that by not disclosing where the minimum was, basically like if there was an auction, you had a reserve price, and they did not tell the industry what that price was. So they realized that that had basically deterred some bidders to actually get these blocks awarded. What they did in the second phase, they changed that. They announced it 2 weeks in advance. That's just one example of many that I could come up with. But what I wanted to say is that it is not easy for a government that is doing such a substantial change in such an important part of the economy to have this receptiveness to feedback that allows it to actually come up with a better model of, let's say, at least the upstream sector, but it also is applied to somewhere else in the energy, in the wider energy realm in Mexico. Where we are now, and I think what it's interesting for most of you, is that we're currently offering in the middle of the licensing round for deepwater. I mean, deepwater has long been claimed to be the crown of the jewels in the crown, let's say. It is one of the last basins that are so underexplored. I mean, in Mexico, you've drilled less than 35 exploration wells in deep water. In the US, you've drilled more than 1,200. I mean, that's a sort of, you can see the contrast that we're talking here. What I think the government has done, once again, they've realized that the market is tough. Exploration is one of the first activities in which companies cut back when you have to reduce budgets. So what they realized and what they've done is to set very realistic minimums that they're asking for industry in order to award these blocks. And we're talking about minimums that would put you right in the middle of other competitive markets. You're comparing yourself to US, Brazil, and whatnot. So by doing that, I think that the government has done a very important thing. And I mean, we've been working different kind of analysis, and I would say that for 3 main reasons, it is very likely that every single block in deep water could be awarded. Number one, every one of those blocks have received at least 2 industry nominations. That's not a deal. That's not something that seals the deal, but let's just say it leads you to my number 2 point. Your royalties are low. Therefore, if you were to discover something in these blocks, they could be potentially interesting. There's no infrastructure, so you need to account for that. But number 3, and more importantly, companies can go into Mexico and commit themselves to going into the block and try to reinterpret seismic and do different things without committing to drilling a well. That does not mean that they will not drill the well, but it's very different when it's an optionality that you can either choose to do so or not to choose that, to do that. So I think that those 3 things make it very likely that a good chunk of the blocks from deep water could be awarded. Also remember that first oil of these blocks will be in the mid-2020s. Trion, and with this one I'll close, that's the JV opportunity with Pemex in deep water. I mean, I see a lot of lawyers here, and the JOA, it's something of a very, very sensitive topic. We can talk later about how does it work, how could it not work. So I see a bit less interest in Trion as a JV, just because of the particularities that perhaps we'll discuss a bit later. So just to sum it up, the government has done a good job overall of understanding what they've done wrong in the past and try to correct those issues or those mistakes in subsequent phases. And I think for that, the government has done a pretty good job. So with that, I'll leave you to.
Thank you. Thank you, Pablo. So Luis, please.
Thank you, Francisco, and thank you to the Bakery Institute for inviting us here at this excellent panel. I'll be very brief in my introduction comments as well, and very much in line with what just Pablo mentioned. I mean, from a legal perspective, at the beginning, there was a lot of skepticism. There was lack of experience by the Mexican authorities. And as a lawyer, the question that most rounded our minds was whether the government was going to be able or not to offer transparency to the process itself and offer investors the comfort in them knowing that not corruption was going to play, that their participation was going to be equal vis-a-vis the other competitors, and that notwithstanding the lack of experience of the government in the process, that with time they were going to be listened by the authorities and take part of their experience so that the whole process, the bidding process themselves in the future would be better and improved than the one that was unfortunately learned in the number 1.1 round, which Pablo referred to, which was a pretty big failure, I would say. So as a lawyer, having the great opportunity of representing clients by our office in Mexico City of different nationalities in all of the bids that have been offered by the government, I can say with a lot of comfort that I applaud the government's effort in respect to having been able to provide that transparency, number one, which was, I think, critical for the rounds to be successful, and two, from being open in listening to the companies and investors and try to improve through the different, there's a saying, the devil is in the details, no? Through the different changes that have been made to the contractual, to the documents that implement the bidding itself, and be able to offer better terms of participation to everyone and try to mitigate the concerns that investors have in this type of processes. So I would only limit my initial comment to that and applaud the government's efforts as well.
Thank you, Luis. Benigna, please.
Well, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here this morning. It's a great opportunity, and I'm very thankful to the organizers to give us the very timely opportunity to review what has been happening in Mexico. As we heard this morning, the Secretary gave us a whole overview of the reform, and to think about that just 10 years ago, nobody would have ever thought that this was going to be possible in Mexico. The Pemex was at the peak of their production, was producing 3.4 million barrels per day, and really nobody thought that there was going to be ever the political will to open the sector to private participation. Interesting enough, if we move back to 5 years ago, we see that the election process was taking place, and among the candidates, there were two of them, actually, that had realized that there was the need for making an energy reform. And this energy reform, the big question was how broad this energy reform was going to be. It was going to be, again, a partial energy reform that Mexico had attempted to do several times, or was going to be something that it was going to be meaningful. And as we all know, the energy reform that has been done has taken us by surprise, because it was literally much further than anybody expected it to be, because it covers the whole value chain. And the most interesting part from that perspective is the fact that the market, the international market, changed at the same time. If you think about 2012, the energy markets were booming with growing demand from China, from India, and oil prices were in the 100 range. And actually the Maya, as the Secretary said, was above $100 per barrel. So there was a lot of optimism about this pushing for this energy reform, because the production in Mexico had started to decline systematically, despite that they were increasing their investment. So there was some support for the energy reform, and the president elected decided to go forward with this very, very aggressive energy reform, and the Congress and the states decided to support it. Interesting enough, those great high prices motivated the producers in the US to start producing shale oil and shale gas that flooded the market, and consequently, the energy reform was approved, as we know, the constitutional change took place in December, and then the prices in 2014 peaked and started to not only come down, but actually collapse. And in this year, the Maya crude, was at $18 at the beginning of this year. So the situation has been significantly different from the time that the energy reform was approved. So what has been the industry response to this new, very difficult and very different environment to the environment within which the energy reform was approved? I guess it's not surprised to realize that the industry, despite this collapsing oil prices, and then that right now we are in the $40 range, there has been an enormous interest. And the interest is demonstrated by the fact that the companies that had been in Mexico supporting the energy reform for many years decided that it was the right time to organize themselves, and we created this AMEXI, which is the Association of Mexican Hydrocarbon Companies, and we have been part of this whole process of providing comments to the government to improve the terms and conditions for the various contracts and the various bid rounds that have taken place. One of the biggest achievements of the partial reform that had been done in 2008 was the creation of the National Hydrocarbons Commission, and the fact that at the beginning of times when it was created, it was a regulator of one company, Pemex. However, after the reform, they have not only continued to be the regulator of Pemex, but also they have become the regulator of the whole bidding process, and following that, the execution of the contract. So, as I said, it has been a very exciting time for all the companies that have been participating in this process. And as you heard this morning, there are already 30 contracts that have been executed through these first 3 bid rounds that have taken place. And 37 companies from around the world are participating. So the whole concept of monopoly has been broken, and already there are, as I said, as the secretary told us this morning, 37 companies participating in this market. So in terms of what has, how does this has affected the industry, I think that the interest has remained very strong. And again, the fact that we see the certainty that the bidding process will continue. 3 rounds have taken place, and there will be future bidding taking place, completely transparent, with very with certainty, with a legal framework and regulatory framework that we can rely on. So that would be the comments I have from the industry perspective. We see that the energy reform, in terms of what this government has done, really offers the certainty that the industry needs. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Benigna. So I see a clear consensus in the table and in the line with what the secretary said earlier, that first of all, we all seem to agree, including me, that this was a very important reform, much more profound than anyone would have imagined a few years back, and that's very impressive. I also saw in all your comments this clear element of the government listening to industry and experts and trying to learn from their past mistakes and improving the process. But I wanted to push back a little bit in terms of evaluating the whole first round in the following sense. First of all, I wonder, if because of what Benigna mentioned, that this was designed originally when the price of oil was at above $100, that if in one round zero Pemex didn't keep too much, even if you consider a different price scenario, I think maybe it was too little. That was sort of disappointing thing. The other question that I have is, what about the fact that a lot of the bidding rounds, led to very high government takes. And even though you could argue, well, but they came up in a bidding process, so what's the problem? Well, the problem is that it might lead to, if they are unsustainable, to less investment than otherwise we would have expected. And so you could try to structure the bidding in a different way to sort of get to a different result. So I would point to those two issues. How do you think about, as far as today, have they offered, the areas that one would have expected with the original reform, and second of all, how to deal with the issue of government take? Whenever, I know if you want to start, Pablo.
Sure.
Yeah.
I think that's an important point because, you mentioned Benigna production, right? We were at 3.4 million barrels per day in 2004. Now we're at 2.1. The current budget says that we'll be next year at 1.9 million barrels. And that has political implications, right? When Peña Nieto came in, it was 2.6, promising to 3. And now we're going to end up the sexenio at 1.9. You need to come up with different ways of proving that the reform is working. My concern there is that the famous JV process with Pemex has been very slow. And here I'm not talking about Trion as a deep water opportunity. I'm talking about the opportunities that could bring production faster. That is onshore fields and shallow water, I would say. There's a peer group, and you were talking about the onshore phase. These were guys that were very small. Most likely them, there were service sector companies with no upstream experience. And yeah, you do need to create a Mexican upstream sector beyond Pemex. However, there is a peer group of companies that could apply EOR, enhanced oil recovery techniques, and other kind of things that up to this point in Mexico have not been prevalent. They have not done it that much. And these sort of fields need to be a bit bigger. And to your point, in round zero, Pemex kept much of those. I don't mind if Pemex keeps some of those if the JV process moves along, but it has been dragging for the last 24 months, and this is not changing. And this is concerning because the only way in which you can really change the trend in production, instead of declining 15% each year, is if you have more people working with these on-stream fields to apply different techniques to them. Just to close with this comment, the fields that were awarded in the third phase of round one, the onshore ones, they're not going to bring on stream more than 60, 70,000 barrels per day. Let's just be honest. The ones in shallow water, the ones where discover resource opportunities, they might bring 100, 120,000 barrels per day, but that's going to be by 2019. So, the only way in which in the next, let's say, 2 years, you could have an increase in activity would be offering these JV opportunities with Pemex under the right conditions. And the JOA of Trion is not the ideal way of thinking of JVs into the future. I hope that's not the case. But just to sum it up, I'd say that yes, I agree. Pemex perhaps kept a bit too much in round zero. And if they were going to keep that, the JV process should have been faster. Obviously, this is a three-way negotiation. Nothing is easy, and it's the first time that it's been done. I'm not basically blaming anyone, but in this world, when you are at $45 per barrel and when your production keeps declining 15% per year, each year, you do need to change something.
Yeah, one thing that I would add to what Pablo has just mentioned, Francisco, is the fact that, of course, conditions in 2013, when the reform was launched, were much different to those in the current period of time. Pemex financial distress is obvious. It's very bad. It's I would say very delicate as well, and this the good news about this is that from an investor's perspective, as just Pablo was mentioning, this will open up definitely a lot of investment opportunities, and I would dare to say even more than those that in the bids themselves, of course taking aside the Trion process, which is in itself the migration of an assigned contractual area to Pemex during round zero. No? So I think that in a nutshell, this will give more opportunities to investors. I think that, as Pablo was just commenting, the JOAs with Pemex in type Trion participations will as well evolve, develop, and improve, as we have seen those in the bids themselves, along with time. That's what I would add.
Yeah, and I think that from the industry perspective, we have to have a reality check in terms of energy reforms. Everywhere else, it has taken up to 5 or 6 years to have the first bid round. And we have seen in Mexico that they had the first bid round in 2015, when the Constitution had been changed in December 2013. So the learning curve has been exceedingly steep, and I think that, to their credit, the government has been willing to listen to the industry, but this is a very complex business. So we cannot just say that it's a matter of them doing things faster. In addition to the fact that you have so many entities that are involved in the process, and you have to change the ship that people have been operating with all their lives. So it is really, I think that we have seen the evolution, and I expect that this evolution will continue. That, as we heard this morning from the secretary, he recognizes that the migration, his view was that was going to be the fastest. The reality is that once they got to actually doing it, it was significantly more complex to get to an agreement in terms of how they were going to value the work, the asset, the infrastructure they had in place. So I think that, as I said, I see this as an evolution, and I'm pretty much convinced that they will get there at the right time.
Thank you. So moving specifically into the deep waters auction that we will have in December, I wonder, what do you think about the rules of the auction, the bidding parameters? I mean, you were very bullish earlier in terms of most of the areas being assigned. Are the areas attractive? What about the bidding parameters? What's going to happen with the bonuses on tie? What does make this a competitive opportunity versus other opportunities that these same companies have all over the world? And how do these opportunities fit as part of a long-term investment strategy, for example, for oil companies such as the big ones and Chevron, et cetera? Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think that the learning process started early on in round one, and I think that's being applied here. I didn't describe Trion, how the bidding parameters work. I mean, just to explain it very simply, for the first time ever in Mexico, there's a maximum royalty bid. So what the government is saying is, look, the minimum you have to offer is 3% additional royalty. This is on top of a price-based royalty, but just to keep it simple, 3%. The maximum is 4%. So basically, if two or more consortia bid 4%, then you need to go to a tiebreaker. And this becomes very interesting because Hacienda, the finance ministry, had the option of saying the tiebreaker is going to be a lump sum payment. But that lump sum payment is going to be split into two. One part will go as additional carry to Pemex. Basically, Pemex finances are not good now, so you need to carry these Pemex through the initial phase of development, and the rest will go as a signature bonus to the government. The interesting thing is, in the contract, Hacienda had the ability to decide what that split would be. What they decided was that 90% of the tiebreaker lump sum would go to Pemex as additional carry. And only 10% of that would go for them as signature bonuses. I mean, this sounds very trivial, but it shows for the first time that I can remember in the last 4 years, a moment in which Hacienda was like, look, Pemex's finances are not good now. We need to help Pemex go forward. And I think this change in mentality tells quite a bit, because Pemex could be the opposite. 10% goes as additional carry of Pemex, 90% goes to the government. And just the fact that they came up with this, I think it's very telling. Overall, deep water, I mean, the reason why I think things look good is simply because the government stopped trying to guess what the market wanted and established guidelines for the market to decide that by themselves. And that's what they did from the first phase of shallow water into the second one. And I think now, assuming these low and these reasonable and competitive minimum bids that they're asking for in deep water allows the companies to actually take a look and see. I mean, I cannot talk about prospectivity because I have not done the data room analysis that perhaps, Benigna's team has done. However, I mean, if you go by industry nominations, you could think that, if people that offer that, the conditions are not committing you to spending $150 million on each area in the next 4 years, I think companies will be happy to reinterpret the seismic, and if they like what they do, what they see there, you might as well drill. But you're not being obligated, and that is a key question. Well, that is a key differentiator, I'd say.
Yeah, I would just add the The awarding process, the awarding factors for bid 1.4, very much alike to those already spelled out by Pablo. There is a combination of an investment factor, which is how many oil fields is the participant willing to develop above the minimum work program. And then, of course, we have the minimum additional royalties that Pablo was referring, which go for the first 4 fields, 1 to 4, 3.9 and 3.1, and then for the second set of fields, 5 to 10, they go 1.9, as I do recall. So this combination, I think, is very market effective. I think I would add to my prior comments that one thing that the government has as well done quite excellently is to work hand by hand on the legal side of things and the economic side of things, just to make this work for investors. Otherwise, we would not be able to compete with other countries which as well have good market conditions in the energy industry. So I would say that, and the fact as well that from a legal perspective, they have developed changes that were of high concern to participants. For example, there was no definition as to what meant grave accident. Now it has at least been set under industry standards, which is, I think, a huge step. As probably, as you may know, in Mexico, we don't have any stare decisis. There is no court precedence. Well, there is, but it's complicated to explain, and I won't do that here now. But what I want to say by this is that there were many open concepts, particularly on the administrative rescission clause and the contractual rescission clause, which talked about fault on behalf of the contractor, which talked about unjustified cause, which talked about grave accident, and they were not defined. And we don't have any standards nor prior experience in Mexico that could provide information either to an arbitrator or to a judge in case of administrative rescission in order for them to be able to award a judgment in real and justice terms. So by the government listening to companies and trying to implement these changes to the contracts, again, the devil is in the details. I think that lots of progress has been made, and there is much more comfort in this respect.
Yeah, and I think that from the industry perspective, the terms and conditions for the bidding are very competitive in terms of, first of all, for the exploration phase, to have a period of 4 years that if you choose to just do seismic or reprocessing of the data without drilling a well, you can do that. And then you can extend this for another 3 years, and then you can extend it again for another 3 years. And to do that, you need to drill a couple of wells. So it is, they really, from our perspective, that is really very competitive. The real issue at this time is, again, given the price environment we are in, is that all the companies are looking at these opportunities in terms of their portfolio and the projects that they have had to delay or stop at this time because our severe constraints in capital availability for developing existing projects that we already have. So the point is, how did these new opportunities fit in the portfolio that we already have? So I see that is the major challenge. The challenge is not in the terms and conditions of the 1.4, but more is how do they fit into the individual companies that are going to be participating.
Great. So let's go into Pemex and the JVs. First, I mean, I agree with Pablo. It's very, very interesting that, I mean, one of the thing that always I found interesting about the Mexican reform compared to others that I have followed is that this one was led by the Ministry of Finance from the very beginning. And of course, there is a history of the Ministry of Finance being, the ruler of the oil sector in Mexico, and that has something to do with the problems that it had in the historical terms. But we have a tremendously good team of technocrats in the Ministry of Finance, and they have learned a lot about the sector, and as you pointed out, they seem to be now less focused on fiscal extraction, and for example that example of the Trion bonus going into carry for Pemex, it shows that they realize that the important things that they are able to, carry their investment and not that much getting upfront revenues. But I wonder, first I would like you to mention what is the issue with Trion that you mentioned that there is this JOI and mention a little bit about it, but also. So what is your expectation about the Trion auction at this time? And what else is Pemex going to be offering in the future? What happened with the secretary mentioned about the service, about the difficulties in the migration of the contracts. So what's going to happen in that regard with the new CEO? How things look like for Pemex in terms of further opportunities in the upstream?
I'm just sorry. Talking about the JOA, I think that Luis and Benigna will have more specifics. Because that's what you guys have probably been looking at much closer than we did. What we think about Trion is that if the JOA does not change, you'll be lucky to have one bid going for it. I think the economics of the project look interesting. However, the contractual terms as they are a non-starter for some companies. It could be they have a week to change that, so that we could see a very different JOA in the next week, and that could change our expectations. Let's remember that we have right now 10 companies pre-qualified for the Trion JV. In a consortium, you must have at least 2 companies being able to be operators. One of them will be the main operator, and you could have a secondary operator. The reason of this is just to make sure that if one of them leaves, you do not leave Pemex without someone that knows how to develop a deep water field. I think that what we could expect, I think the asset will be awarded. What I've heard is that the JOA will be improved, so I would not be surprised if that is also awarded. Talking about Pemex and the JVs very briefly, I think that the thing there is that you are already reducing Pemex's budget for next year, understandably. Oil, if you're assuming the hedging at $42 Brent, that's what the price must be in order for the Mexican puts to be in the money. So if you're the finance ministry, you are looking ahead and you're saying, well, we really need to cut down, and Pemex obviously is not going to be invulnerable to that. So in my view, I think you need to change this as quickly as you can. I hope that the Trion JV is like opening the floodgates and try to make this happen faster, because there are a lot of companies that have not been able to get into Mexico because the opportunities have not been there. And I'm talking about that sweet spot of medium to larger shallow water and onshore fields that up to this point we have not really had the chance to have access to. If you talk about the ROM 2.2, and with this one I'll close, we can talk more about gas later. I think that the exploration acreage on offer is gas prone. And when you have the amount of gas coming into Mexico and only to be doubled in the next, let's call it 6 to 10 years, then you have a very tough job as a producer to be able to compete against those cheap prices of gas imports from Texas. But I don't know what you think, Luis.
Yeah, I perfectly agree with you, Pablo, and maybe Benigna will also have some comments to the effect. I think that, as I said before, I do see a bright future in joint ventures with Pemex. I think that the government has no option. Okay, here is a situation about market conditions and about Pemex, both financial and technical capabilities, and from a technical capabilities perspective. Pemex has not the money, has not the experience nor technical capacities to do deep water, so there is really no option here. I think that the government needs to be humble in this respect and accept the fact that if we want the energy reform to be successful, if we want all of the potential that is in the Gulf of Mexico to be really exploited to its full extent and become the energy monster that we want to, we need to be humble and lower all of those requirements that both from a legal and economic perspective may not be that good for the investors, starting from the participation that Pemex has in the current Trion bid. No, I mean 45% for a company like Pemex in its position, I think it's too much. I don't know if Benigna will agree with me, but I do think that the authority has to be more humble and just see the reality. Pemex has no money, and Pemex in deep water at least has very little capacity. I don't know many.
Yeah, one of the interesting things about Trion is talking about the minimum work program that is required is one of the big differences between the exploration blocks that are being offered and Trion. As I mentioned to you, in the case of the exploration blocks, there is no obligation to drill a well unless you choose to extend the exploration period from to 7 years. In the case of Trion, there is the obligation to drill 3 wells, which of course in this time, given the current environment, is just a very, very stiff requirement in terms of commitment. So that is an example of one of the limitations or the lack of understanding of the market conditions to include that as a requirement. At the same time, the JOA has included, and we haven't seen the revised version, that, for example, Pemex had the ability to propose changing an operator without any specific reasons, literally. Well, that is completely unacceptable in terms of this type of contract, that you are not going to get into a contract and be the operator without knowing if you are going to be changed or not. It's just not the industry practice. So, as I said, these are comments that have been provided by Amexi to CENER and to CNH. So we will see how amenable is the government to proceed with changes like those ones. I have just given you a couple of examples.
Great. So it seems I'm taking from what you're saying that it's Pemex and not the Ministry of Finance or CENER that that is behind these not as attractive features of the joint operating agreement, or?
I wouldn't know, to be honest, because I think that every decision has been made up to this point has been like a 3-way or even more so the commerce. So I could not put, let's say, the responsibility on anyone specifically. And I think that's such a complex matter. I would assume would include all the players, but I would just say that whatever committee we can come up to in the next week, these terms and conditions can be made more competitive, internationally speaking. It is much needed because Trion would be the first deep water oil production in Mexico. And I mean, you have no time to lose.
Yeah, and the first Pemex JV, so it's a very important, yeah.
Yeah, I think that the fact that the Ministry of Finance will no longer play such an important role in decision-making process regarding the economics on all of this, I think that will help. I think that now the Ministry of Energy and Pemex in itself and other regulators like the CNH, etc., will have much more of a say. So I see the change in the administration regarding the movement of the Ministry of Finance as a positive one, rather than as a negative one, as it has to do with respect to the energy reform in Mexico, no?
Yeah, and from the point of view of Pemex, I think that the current CEO has been very clear in recent opportunities that I have had. He has been giving talks on this topic, where they really his mandate is to apply the energy reform to get partnerships. So I think that there is the interest to get there. The point again is going to be how long does it take them to get there.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's clear. I mean, he has sent very strong signals that he wants to use all the resources of the reform to open up further. And I guess the fact that the only good thing about the fact that we are in a low oil price environment is that it's forcing them to think harder and move faster in many ways that they would have done. And we know that only crisis generate the opportunities for reform, and in that sense that will be the one of such cases. So in terms of the you already mentioned a little bit about round two, and the secretary today mentioned the possibility that maybe what was going to be 1.5 is now going to be 2.4, sort of the shale, 2.3. He said 2.4, but I don't know if he meant maybe it was 2.3. But anyways. I wonder what is your perspective on what we already know about round two and this potential addition of shale. Are there conditions, the market conditions there for this to happen? And what is your take out on this?
Yeah, I think it all depends on the terms and conditions. I mean, obviously, I'm caveating here, but just to, let's say, go full front on the question, there's a lot of potential in Mexico on conventionals. I mean, no question about it. People like to talk about the Eagle Ford extension. Sure, that seems great, but in Mexico, it tends to be very gassy. And as you know, gas at the prices where we are, that's not what you're really looking for. You want liquids. Liquids are actually in the Jurassic, in the Pimienta Formation. And in Mexico, let's say you've drilled, I don't know, 35, 40 wells with targeting shale. Only one of them has found liquids. I mean, at least in a reasonable way. I mean, this had an initial production of 300 barrels per day. What this challenges you as companies is that now you're having, I mean, you see lately the M&A move, the M&A activity has been focused in the lower 48, right, in the U.S. I mean, if you're asking these companies they already understand the U.S., they already understand the regulatory aspect of it, they have a completely developed supply chain. For them to go into Mexico and take all the risks that they could take, it is a lot to ask unless the terms are really, really good. The problem is who's going to prove up the play. In Argentina, for example, Vaca Muerta, initially, YPF took the lead as well with Chevron to try to come up and say, Vaca Muerta, look, there's a lot of potential, but what can we do with that potential? That is because YPF, if you take a look at their portfolio, that is the future of YPF. Vaca Muerta is. For Pemex, right now with reduced budgets, if you're Pemex, you can go into heavy oil offshore, deep water, onshore EOR. You can have so many different things. And if you have less budget than before, if you're Pemex, you're not going to prove up the unconventionals now. The question is who's going to do so. And I think the question for the unconventional phase you have to answer first is market conditions regarding price. If it's gas, low price. If I'm going to find oil, where is that oil? Who's going to help me find that sweet spot? That's number one. Second is above ground risk. I mean, let's just be very honest. I mean, situation in northern part of Mexico is tough security-wise. I mean, even access to water is not that easy. And the supply chain there was supporting Pemex doing conventional drilling in Burgos, not unconventionals where you could have more nimble operations moving faster along. So just to sum it up, this sort of long-winded answer, I think that unconventionals will be developed in Mexico, but I don't think that will be the case in the short term, as I think that market conditions are not quite there. But I mean, that is our view. I'm not saying that's going to be the case.
I mean, I have no other. I fully agree with Pablo. There's just not today the market condition for that to happen. I do understand why the government has been delaying the situation there. Unless prices go up and it makes sense from an economic standpoint, I don't see it happening soon. I think that the government will focus in other things that may happen. No.
What about the what's been announced in terms of round two? Do you have any comments on?
No, I mean, with respect to the bidding process itself, I think that a 2.1 is an effort to make 1.1 work now. The repackaging of the contractual areas, I think, has been a very intelligent move and much more attractive than it used to be with smaller areas. And in addition to that, the fact that the bidding rules are being much more flexible in as to, for example, if you provided all documentation that was necessary to qualify under round 1.1, and you are doing now 2.1, you're participating, then you are waived from resubmitting again all the, it kind of what's happening with Trion as well, and 1.4, participants in 1.4 who got access to the data information center are no longer needed to resubmit information for Trion if they are participating in Trion. So, you know, I think that the government is helping participants, is helping to attract, it's from both a legal and economic standpoint. So that would be my comment.
I think that from that perspective, the government has been very smart in offering different types of opportunities for different types of companies and different size of companies. So you can see that the 2.1 is likely to attract 2.1, I'm sorry, is likely to attract medium-sized companies. And as unconventionals, they haven't offered them yet, and I think that that is reasonable given the market conditions. So I think that there is a plan here that what has happened in round one is not one opportunity, one event period. There is a process here that I think is going to be a lasting process that we will be seeing bid rounds over several years.
Thank you. So I want to open up now for any questions from the floor. We have microphones. If you are interested in making a question, you can please go there.
Again, I think a really excellent discussion among the panel. Question for Benigna from Chevron's perspective, and perhaps for the rest of the panelists from your client's perspective, because I think it's useful. You know, one of the things that has been a recurring thing is that panelists have said, let's take a step back and look at how quickly Mexico has been doing this, and look at the other comparisons of how long it's taken even the United States to generate open markets on the energy side. So I also think it's useful, though, to even take another step back and think about the world geography, and think about how, you know, other than the shale revolution, there have not been any significant discoveries of you know, sort of big oil deposits in the recent period, other than shale and this alpine discovery in West Texas. So if you think about that from a geologic perspective, and you think about the risks, yes, there's risks in northern Mexico, but there are tremendous risks in virtually every other geography where oil and gas is active. And so I wonder, you know, the Chevron boardroom and boardrooms similar across the big oil and gas companies in the world, as they think through where they want to be, not tomorrow or the next day or 5 years from, where they want to be 20 years from now, 30 years, and what the future holds. And then you add to that some of the other advantages of Mexico. You know, sure, there are hiccups and there are issues along the way that are short-term issues, considering the compressed time period to get this done. But then one of the other themes, I think, of this discussion has been the leadership of Mexico. We have Senegas there, and the leadership, we have the secretary, has been very willing to listen to feedback from industry. So you have a circumstance where the Mexican leadership is responding to industry information. You have all of the promises of geology. I mean, it's not just the Eagle Ford that extends into northern Mexico. It's, you know, if you're on a plane across the Gulf of Mexico, you know, the waters in the U.S. Gulf are all lit up at night because there are platforms that have filled up that part of the Gulf. But the Mexican Gulf, it's sort of like North Korea, South Korea, right? I mean, it's the light on the South Korean side, dark. I mean, which means that there are tremendous, obvious opportunities. We know with certainty what the Eagle Ford has meant to the United States. We know with certainty what we produced in the U.S. Gulf and what that's meant for the Gulf Coast. And then you add one other, I think, seemingly obvious but undersold advantage of Mexico, which is proximity. I mean, the idea that you can fly from Houston and be in Mexico City in a matter of hours. Compare that to any other area in the world of rich opportunities for exploration and production. It just seems to me, you know, listening to all the panels today, what the future holds for the Mexican government, what the future holds in terms of obvious promise for discovery, that if I'm on the board of Chevron, which, by the way, I'd be happy to be on the board of Chevron. But as you make those calculated strategic decisions and you multiply that across all of the large integrated oil and gas companies across the world, I would have to think Mexico has got to be, front and center as a short-term, medium-term, and long-term opportunity for investment.
As I mentioned before, we have a portfolio of opportunities in the current environment. Those opportunities are being evaluated as part of that portfolio, and Mexico is going to be evaluated in those terms, in terms of the portfolio we have, considering those advantages as well as the disadvantages that potentially they have given the current conditions. So they are going to be evaluated, and I hope that they will go to the high point, but I don't know really how they want to look at the end once we need to make the corporation needs to make a decision.
One of the very perplexing and confusing aspects of round 1.4 and the Trion and in relation is the notion that we're talking about farmouts. And the Mexican government has never explained farmouts, never defined it, but somehow they're attached to this term. Well, there's a very technical issue here that I'd like anyone on the panel to comment on. In a farmout, you get your working interest in the lease only after you have performed an earning event, after you've done something. In a JOA, or you get the working interest on the day you sign the contract. So the question is, when in the Trion auction, when does the winner receive the working interest in the Pemex lease? Is the question clear?
I mean, I think that there's a confusion with respect to Trion and migrations, farmouts, because Trion is a migration but of an already assigned contractual area to Pemex, which is different from a farmout itself. I mean, from a legal perspective, we're seeing at two different situations here. Now, as to the economics, Pablo, I don't know if you would like to answer that question.
I mean, the main thing is contractual, I'd say. I mean, because the question is, when do you actually become owner of that? I mean, you would say whenever you actually sign the contract, right? I mean, which I think to your point would be that it doesn't work. The problem here is conceptual by calling it farmout, as you were saying. Maybe you could call it a different way, perhaps JB. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, therefore, Luis, that's on you. But I'd say that, I mean, in the legal aspect of things, that's more of the contractual aspect. If you talk about the economics, and I'm not responding to your question, but I think it's an interesting point, which is if those issues are fixed, then, I mean, Trion provides you the opportunity of being the king of Perdido in the Mexican side, right? I mean, you will be the first person to be the first company operating in Perdido, and at least you'll have a couple years of advantage, and you'll decide sort of the destiny of Perdido. So, I mean, if the things that you're mentioning, which once again, I'm not responding to your question, so sorry, George, but I think the economics of Trion makes it quite an interesting thing, at least to try to fix it on the legal aspects of things.
Why do you say why do you think the government continues to use the term farmout when they don't define it?
I really believe that there is just a misuse of the terms. I mean, there is. I mean, when I saw the minister's slides on the Trion farmout, I said, I don't think this is a farmout. I think this is just an assignation of an already, it's a migration of an already assigned contractual area to Pemex, which is different. You're totally right. I mean, that's what I have to say from a legal perspective. There's a confusion here. Definitely.
One example to you very quickly, license versus concession, right? I mean, honestly, I mean, the way the fiscal aspect of that works is a royalty tax regime. Whether you call it license, you call it concession, there is no difference. Once again, the Constitution says license, and concessions had this sort of negative connotation. That is why things are what they are. But
It's a historical
semantics.
issue,
Yeah. It's purely semantics. Huh?
Menina, do you have any other questions? Since we have 5 more minutes, and I want to take advantage of you here, I just wonder if you could tell me a little bit of what would be the sort of the challenges for the future of the implementation of the reform. Issues, for example, of infrastructure in terms of the infrastructure needed for the development of deep offshore. Are the conditions met there? In terms of the issues that some of you mentioned, in terms of land ownership and sort of the social and sort of the local communities' impact, security issues, crime. I wonder which issues you think will be the issues that. And finally, the hard question that was asked to the secretary, which is, what happens if the new president of Pemex, of Mexico, sorry, is someone who dislikes these reforms and wants to turn them back?
Yeah. You want to start with infrastructure, perhaps, or no? There you go. No, then I'll be very. I mean, I think that there's several risks, and the reason why people have tried to avoid onshore up to this point is because of what you mentioned, above ground risk, being security, being community issues. I mean, let's remember in Peru, in some occasions, a well permit takes 18 to 24 months to get it. So, I mean, that is the sort of things that you're not considering your initial economics, but then when you're actually halfway through, you're like, well, what should we do now? Offshore, I mean, deep water, the key question is, are you going to use infrastructure on the U.S. side, what you have already with Shell, BP, and Chevron in Great White? There's spare capacity in the Williams pipeline. If you're first, can you get that capacity? Perhaps. Would you like to go the FPSO route? There's only one FPSO in Mexico. Shallow water. In the US Gulf, they were prohibited, but I mean, lately, Petrobras actually has a couple. So you're basically in uncharted territory. I mean, you have to decide what you're going to do. You want to go all the way back to Mexico and do a pipeline which is going to be extremely expensive? Maybe. Who's going to decide that? The first mover. And I think that's when you talk about first mover advantage, and that's why I think that whoever moves quickly into Perdido can actually dictate some of the conditions that the rest of the people will have to follow. So I think that offshore, very different challenges than onshore, but either way, you'll have to deal with them because otherwise implementation will be much slower.
Yeah, I would say that actually when we get to the phase of the execution of these contracts is when we really start facing the reality of the implementation of the regulations and the regulators, their ability to provide the permits, to provide the comments, to accelerate this process, because they are very prescriptive in terms of what are the reports that the companies that win blocks have to submit to the CNH. And the CNH is a very, very young organization. So what is their ability to process all this information, to provide feedback to the companies, and the companies to actually execute the contract, considering that you have to get in advance, to hire in advance a platform, and the engagement that takes. Are you going to have the right time? Are they going to be able to respond to you within the time that you need to or not? So I think that the challenge for the Mexican side is going to be all these new agencies that are brand new. In the case, for example, the environmental agency, the industrial safety, it was just created this time in 2013, and it started functioning last year, in March. So it's brand new. What is the experience they have in approving the programs that they are requiring? And it's not going to be 2 or 3, it's going to be 20, 30. There are 30 contracts already signed, plus all the new ones. So just to manage the contracts is going to be a major, major challenge.
No, I think that just the government needs to keep on working hand by hand with the private community, with the private investors. I think that the government must focus on real opportunities which are still interesting to the market out there, not those that may not, and that's the example of the shale gas. I mean, those are no opportunities now, but there are others that there are. We have seen as lawyers for our clients that clients continue to be interested in participating in those opportunities that are more long-term, so long that the government keeps on doing their job. So I would just say that, keep on working hand by hand, focusing on real opportunities right now, leave what is not under market conditions feasible, and then continue to work.
Perfect. One last brief question.
Thank you. I would like to address the panel. Before the reform, historically, Pemex was the governing body. And one of the purposes of the reform, in a way, is to have Pemex more equal, in an equal level, with a private contractor. So you were speaking in this panel about the JVs and the JOAs, and maybe Trion is a very good example right now. Even though this activity, this hydrocarbons activity, obviously are regulated, and CNH has a special interest, and that is why you signed the exploration and production contract with CNH. But you have the JOA, in this bid round, and my question is, what do you think about a contractor, and putting the example of Chevron, an international prestigious company, coming to Mexico? I think there is two ways to see this. Either you can have a feeling of comfort of partnering with Pemex and trying to break the market or enter the market by doing this alliance with Pemex, which has been historically the only entity operating the market in Mexico, knowing the information and knowing the geology. And I think the counter side would be, I, as a contractor, want to really be in an equal standing, And it comes to my idea that maybe there is over-regulation in this part of the JOA, I mean, I was just thinking, what if more CNET and CNH just really give certain lineamientos, I mean, certain highlights or certain points of what the JOA must have, and then have the parties really freely agree the terms and conditions, maybe subject to an authorization or a blessing from the authority. So, I would like to hear your opinion on that.
Yeah, the reality is that the JOA is an agreement that is signed between private parties. So we negotiate the JOA with our partners. The difference in this case is that the JOA really is is providing Pemex, came with the first draft of the JOA. So that's the reason why the comments are, the negotiation is not with Pemex because Pemex is not allowed to negotiate. So they have to provide the comments have to be given to the government, in this case to CNER and to CNH, for them to modify the JOA. So this is not the international practice. The international practice is that the JOA is negotiated between the private parties. But this is, again, given the Pemex characteristics, the government chose to do this.
And again, I mean, just very briefly, the more that the government and the authority sticks to industry practices, the more than the reform will be successful. If we don't do things as Benigna is saying, your example is clear, it's perfect, we won't really be successful. Or we will, but in a limited circumstance, no?
Well, thank you very much. We will have some final remarks by Tony Payan, but please thank our great panelists.
3 years ago, in August, the Secretary Baker and Ambassador Durigen called me to their office and asked me about Mexico. And at that point, the idea of the Mexico Center was born. We opened our doors 3 years ago on August 1st. And as you can see, the agenda of the Mexico Center has been broad and wide, from the rule of law to energy to economics and infrastructure to the U.S.-Mexico border, and then minor agendas on politics and economics, education, infrastructure, telecommunications, and human mobility. And we have our hands on all these broad agenda. Energy, however, was a historical moment as we opened the Mexico Center, and has been one of the most active areas. And the Baker Institute has this enormous advantage that it has a long-established Center for Energy Studies. It's an asset to the Mexico Center, and vice versa. I hope we're becoming an asset to the Energy Center, and coordinatingly, we will certainly continue to develop this agenda. To conclude, I just want to thank everyone for attending this conversation this morning. I want to thank everyone at the panel, and I want to thank Haynes and Boone for sponsoring this event and co-organizing it with us, particularly Hal Means and George Gonzalez. This is the third America's Colloquium that we have organized, one in late 2013, one in early 2015, and this one in later 2016. So this has been a very productive partnership, and we've walked hand in hand over the last 3 years looking at Mexico's energy reform. And finally, I want to thank all the people behind the event. We often forget that there's a lot of work. There is an AV team right behind this wall, and there is a design and editorial team right behind that wall. And there's, of course, the Mexico Center staff, Lisa Waqueta, who's a kind of a yo-man, yo-woman, I guess, would be, pulling all the strings to organize this event, and the logistics people as well. So thank you, everyone. We have a good evening, and go to lunch, and thank you, everyone, for participating. Good night.